to stay and preach there, mate. You're getting quite into that. Thank you so much. Amazing chapter, and I confess now that I am going to look carefully at my watch because I would love to stand here for about 3 hours and talk about this amazing chapter. It is such a profound insight into the workings of the mission of God. So I'm going to attempt to do some things in a much shorter space of time. First of all, I'm going to tell you an incident that happened in my family that helped me and very especially helped my children to understand how God goes before us when we step out in mission. We were spending a weekend in the city of Rouen. I put this watch on here and then it doesn't. I'm going to put it back on my wrist because it won't stand on there. We were visiting the city of Rouen because we were planning to go and move there from the UK. We'd been working with Youth for Christ back in the old days in the UK, and then we were moving to work with Jeunesse pour Christ in France with 3 young children. And this was to be their first major move across. Now, I know France is only just across the water. I live there now. But believe me, the two cultures are quite different. And for my kids, it was quite a big thing that they were going to make this move. So we arranged a weekend to take them over, look at schools, and just sort of give them some reassurance, really. And disaster happened about 24 hours before we were due to get the ferry. The car I had been driving for several months completely died. It was officially proclaimed dead. It just seized up and was taken off the road, and we had no transport. So at the last minute, we were able to borrow a car, which was really good news, except that we borrowed it from Operation Mobilization. Now, I don't know if any of you know OM. OM is a global mission agency who has a particular gift in the resurrection of unusable vehicles. In fact, I've met now, there's a guy called Al, lovely man, who's in Brussels, who has run the base in Brussels or aspects of it for many, many years. And he told me that in the old days, in the early days of OM, when their funding was really stretched, they would literally gather teams in Brussels who were due to go to all parts of Europe, including behind the Iron Curtain. And he and a friend would go to the scrapyard and they'd say, have you got any vehicles that nobody wants? And they would get a vehicle that had been abandoned. They'd take it back. They'd fiddle with it with some elastic bands and sellotape. And they would send teams down to Moscow in it, which I think is just, that's not brave. I don't know what it is. Anyway, so they were really good at, after they'd offered to lend me a car, it was only when I went to collect it that I discovered that it was a 20-year-old Lada. Which was officially known as a car. It was, in fact, a tractor with seats attached. It had this enormous tractor, it was great, actually, great fun. Anyway, we took this car and off we went to Rouen. And we had some interesting experiences with the car. The petrol gauge didn't work, so we never knew if we had any, all this kind of interesting stuff. And then on one particular, it was on the Saturday afternoon, we were driving through Rouen, and every light on this dashboard began to flash at me in very alarming ways. And there was one of those lovely old-fashioned oil pressure gauges which went, and it was clear that something very serious had happened to the car. So I pulled into a car park and I opened the bonnet and I looked, and essentially there was oil everywhere except in the engine. I mean, it had just, the oil had exploded out of the engine. When I tested it, there was nothing in the engine. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. I mean, we hadn't had time. It was a last minute thing to get any kind of breakdown cover. I said to Chrissy, we're not even going to get this car back to the ferry, let alone home. We're not even going to get back to our accommodation. This thing is not going anywhere. I don't know. I didn't know whether it was completely dead or what had happened to it. So we did 2 things. We sat with the kids, and they were all going, oh, what are we going to do? We're in a foreign country. It was all kind of scary. They were very young at the time. And we did 2 things. One is I went and bought 5 litres of oil as an act of faith, but knowing that if I put it back in, it's only going to come out. And then I said to the children, what we're going to do is we're going to pray. Because we're in this city because we believe God is calling us here. We're on this weekend because we believe God is asking us as a family to step out in mission. So we're going to trust God that he's going to rescue us in this situation. We're not going to call the AA, they don't want to talk to us, but we're going to pray that God will sort this out for us. So I was so petrified. Do you know why I was scared? I wasn't scared because of the car. I was scared for my children's faith. Because I'm praying with my young children saying, we're going to ask God to help us here. Let's see what happens. So we prayed and we sat there. And there was only one other group of people in the car park at the time, and that was a gang of teenagers. And they were doing teenage things, hanging out with a kind of crazy souped-up Renault 5 and just kind of very street kids, lovely kids, kind of hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. And they were kind of watching me, this strange man with this very ancient car and the bonnet open, looking confused, And then a little while after we prayed, a girl came over from this group. And she said to me, my French is okay, so I understood that, we communicated in French. She said, my friends would like to know if they can help you, because they're all trainee car mechanics. And they wondered if maybe they could help you. And I thought, that's nice, great. And they came over, and I am going to tell you exactly what happened. Okay, what happened was this young guy, he was about 16, long, scruffy hair. He looked at my engine, and he said, there's a hole in the edge of the engine casing that all that oil has come out for. He says, what you need to do is, a bolt has fallen out. You need to put a bolt back in that hole. And then he said, I think I've got one in the car. I won't be a moment. And he went back to his car, and he came back with a little bolt, and he put it in, and the engine was fixed. And we drove away, and my kids spent the rest of that day with their mouths open. They just sat in the back of this car going, what just happened? And what happened was that they began to understand that when you adventure with God, God, in strange and miraculous and sometimes slightly weird ways, goes before you. God is in the places to which he calls you. You are never called to a place where God is not. Cross-cultural mission does not mean crossing from where God is to where God is not. It means crossing from where you are comfortable to where you are not comfortable, but God is there. I wanted to show you some paintings by a lovely artist called Charlie Mackesy, a London-based artist. Some of you will have seen his work already without realizing it, because he actually designed that question mark on the Alpha posters that man's carrying. His Alpha posters have been everywhere, but he's also a serious artist as well as doing question marks. And he paints a lot of paintings themed on the prodigal son, or in fact, the prodigal daughter as well. He describes himself as pathetically obsessed with hugging. And he paints and sculpts consistently this idea of the embrace of God, this idea that in everyone's heart there is a longing to be embraced, to be accepted, to be loved. And that longing is the heart of what love means, and it's the heart of what the gospel means. This picture you may have even seen, it's gone around on cards and on the internet and stuff. It's called the prodigal daughter. It's a lovely, lovely image. And written across it are his sort of retelling of the story of the prodigal daughter. It should really, he says, be called the running father, who waited every day for her girl. It does look like her girl. He means his girl, but he's got it both. For his girl to come home. The daughter who had rejected him so badly, but when he saw her from a long way off, he ran to her. That prodigal embrace. And I want to ask us the question this morning, and I think it's the question that Paul is meeting head on in Acts 17, in this amazing cross-cultural encounter. The question is this: is there an end to God's embrace? Is there a limit to the embrace of God? Are there people beyond the embrace of God? Because what Paul discovers, I believe, in Acts 17, and what we discover as we journey with him in Acts 17, is that whilst you may be asked at some point in your life to speak to someone who does not have a conscious relationship with God, you will never speak to someone with whom God does not have a conscious relationship. See, you may meet people who in vernacular terms you would say don't know God, but you will never meet people that God does not know. There is nobody outside of God's knowledge and awareness and love. And those to whom you go may be strangers to you, but you are meeting someone in whose life God is already present. Because according to Acts 17, if God was not present in their lives, there would be a word to describe them: dead. Because it is by the permission and the grace and the love and the faithfulness of God that they take every single breath. Every time you breathe, you celebrate the grace of God. Every time any person on this planet breathes, they celebrate the grace and the faithfulness and the love of God. Because it is by the grace of God that we even exist. And Paul discovers that embrace of God going further than he thought. Essentially, we're seeing Paul in a kind of a between trains situation. He's in a layover. His travel plans have been changed. As it's a lovely thing to look actually in Acts. Some of the most significant moments in the Acts of the Apostle takes place when the Holy Spirit interrupts what we thought were very good plans. And Paul's plans have been interrupted. He's stuck in Athens, and as he wanders around Athens, he is disgusted by what he sees. You can translate it very distressed, deeply disturbed. Sick to the stomach is a reasonably good translation of what's being said here. He finds it abhorrent. Why? Because Paul is Jewish. And in Jewish thinking, idolatry is the worst possible sin. So to go around a city that is openly full of idols, it's actually similar to the experience that a lot of Christians who come from a fairly conservative background have when we lived in Amsterdam for 4 years, and when they come and visit Amsterdam and walk around the red light district. Because idolatry is the closest thing in Paul's experience to pornography, actually. It's like being confronted with something that he's been told from childhood to avoid. At all costs, flee idolatry. And yet this city is full of idols. And out of his Jewish experience and his culture and who he is as a person, his first reaction is disgust. He's repelled by it. And yet, a little bit later, we don't know, hours, days probably, so a few days later, when he rises to speak to the key philosophers in the city, the first thing he says to them is, "Men of Athens, I see you are very religious." He connects with them at the level of the very thing that's been disgusting him. Something has happened in Paul's thinking in those few days. Something has happened that this ugly frog of an idolatrous city has been kissed and has become a wonderful prince or princess. And Paul suddenly is filled with love and compassion, and he's enjoying talking to these people. He's connecting with them at a level that before he couldn't because he was disgusted. Something has changed. As he's walked around the city, what he's seen and heard and touched and tasted and smelled somehow has spoken to him. And I'm going to just suggest 4 areas of evangelism, I guess, 4 things that seem to happen in Paul's address that for me have become paradigms of what I think mission needs to become in our 21st century culture. And if you don't think Acts 17 is for the 21st century, just go back to that lovely verse, because which is in parenthesis in Luke's account, "For it should be known the Athenians love nothing more than to sit around talking about all the new ideas." If you don't think that's a description of Western culture in the 21st century, then you obviously don't have an internet connection in your home. We're obsessively talking about the new. We're obsessed with new ideas and different things. And in the midst of that, God is teaching us how to connect. 4 things that happen to Paul. First of all, engaging with culture. Mission as the last art of listening. The most important part of Paul's presence in Athens isn't the speech on Mars Hill on the Areopagus, and isn't the moment of being disgusted. It's the journey in between. It's those days of walking around the city. And I know that he's listening and looking and willing to learn. How do I know that? Because he says, "I saw all these idols." You see, his heart was saying, "Flee from idolatry." But the Holy Spirit said, "Look closer, Paul. Look closer." And he got close enough to read the inscriptions. He got close enough to understand the heart of the idolatry. And he got so close that he found this inscription that said, "To an unknown God." And the Holy Spirit said, "There you go, Paul. I told you that if you look closer, you would find something unexpected and surprising." And he finds this inscription that becomes the basis of his whole approach to these people. He listens, he learns, he hears what's going on, he hears their hearts, he hears the human cry. One of our problems, and I know that in many ways I'm saying things that are part of your journey, and these are issues that you've been wrestling with even as a denomination and as local congregations. But one of the primary things about this shift to a more missional understanding of church is about listening. Listening to people, listening to your culture, listening to the town in which you live. Hearing what is actually happening and what is the cry of the human heart. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but to go back to the images of Charlie Mackesy and the prodigal son, if just for a moment, just imagine for 1 second that somewhere in your town there is somebody looking after pigs, and in that man or woman's heart there is a little thought that says, "I need to get out of this situation.